Now that we've gone through how hearing works in the ear, we need to also go through how equilibrium and orientation works with our ear. Now, inside both the semicircular canals and the vestibule, you're going to have these vestibular apparatus. The whole point of the vestibular apparatus is to allow us to maintain our balance, maintain our orientation upright versus laying down versus bending over. It's helping us understand where we are in relation to the ground. You're going to have these vestibular receptors monitoring static equilibrium. You then have these semicircular receptors monitoring dynamic equilibrium. If you're saying, well, what's the difference? What's the difference of static versus dynamic? Well, the vestibular receptors, which are monitoring static, is if you're standing in place, you're not moving. Your body can tell that, hey, I'm standing upright, there's no movement, everything's here, it's static. While in the semicircular canals, the dynamic equilibrium is if you're sitting in a car and all of a sudden it starts to accelerate. You feel that acceleration and you know that it's moving. Think about if you've been in an elevator. Besides that initial jerk as it starts to move, can you really tell that you're moving if it's a slow elevator? Not necessarily. Some of the higher speed elevators of skyscrapers, sure, you can feel those moving. But a lot of times, once that initial jerk of the start moves, you can't tell an elevator is necessarily moving because it's moving so slow, except for what you hear, and therefore you know it's moving. So static equilibrium, stationary, they look at dynamic movement. Now, inside of this static equilibrium, the receptors, we have what's referred to as the maculae. Now, these are the sensory receptors, what basically receive the external stimuli. You're saying, well, what's the stimuli? How does this work? They're containing different supporting cells and hair cells. Now, these hair cells are stereocilia and kinocilium. They're hairs that stick right up out of the membrane. But that is then paired with this other component, the otolithic membrane. It kind of fills in all the spaces around the hair. And I'll show a graphic in a second what this all is. But you have these hairs sticking up, and then this fluid fills in the gaps in between the hairs. So, okay, so how does that work as a receptor? We're on the ground because of gravity. A fluid is going to slide down a membrane based on gravity. So if you tilt your head, for example, that otolithic membrane slides this way. If you tilt your head this way, it slides that way. The otolithic membrane responds to gravity. So these are receptors because the movement of the otolithic membrane is responding to gravity. That moves the stereocilia and kinocilia. Those are the actual receptors. When they bend, that sends a signal saying, hey, we're bending this direction. Hey, we're bending that direction. So it's a receptor based on gravity, which also means that's why if you're ever underwater and you kind of do a somersault underwater, you might not know exactly which way is up to start with. Because the amount of gravity in water, because you're more suspended, is a little bit different. And the more you spin, the harder it is for your body to orientate quickly which way is up versus down. Think about if you've ever been on a roller coaster that has a whole lot of loops in it. Well, after those loops are over, you might have a little bit of equilibrium issue just for a moment until your body realizes, hey, I'm not moving. This is gravity pulling me down. So it's looking at that. Or if you've ever been on anything that spins a lot, and all of a sudden you stop spinning, you feel like you're still going. If you're on a boat, constant motion, then you stop. All these are based on your body's trying to adapt to where it's at, and then have to adapt again when it stops moving because of how these otoliths are moving based on gravity. So I mentioned this otolithic membrane. It's not just going to be a fluid, like a jelly-like fluid, but it has these actual calcium-based stones in there. So it's a combination of hard calcified stones inside a jelly-like solution. That allows for a little more impact on gravity because the gravity is really pulling on these stones to make sure they move. You're going to have then also two other types of receptors here. You're going to have the utricular hairs. Now these utricular hairs are horizontal movement. Moving forward, moving back, moving side to side. Understanding a horizontal movement in relation to gravity. But you can move otherwise differently than that. You can move vertically, which is where the saccular hairs are. These saccular hairs are vertical movements. That's why you understand and know if you're moving up or you're moving down, because you have these saccular hairs for vertical movements. So horizontal as well as vertical movements are picked up by these two particular types of hair receptors. All right, so let's look at this for a second. Here we have the hair cells. They're kind of sticking up here off the membrane. But then you can notice above that and filling the space is all this oolithic membrane. It's all around, filling the space between the hairs and covering them. So as you can see, you tilt your head tilts to the side, gravity pulls the owlets down, causing the stereocilia and kinocilia to bend. As they bend, that sends a receptor signal down and is received and picked up saying, hey, we're bent to the right, we're bent to the left. But the same exact thing happens as you accelerate forward. Gravity pushes the owlets back. As you decelerate or you stop, gravity pulls the owlets forward. As you go up in an elevator, for example, gravity pushes down just a little bit, which causes the hairs on the side to kind of pull down a little more. So you're going to have hairs that are orientated in all different aspects. You can see that right here we have a cut in the utricle, for example, right up here, and the hairs are pointing up. But that's horizontal movements. What you're not seeing is the saccule here. The hairs are coming from the side. So they naturally sit down a certain amount. But if you accelerate going up, gravity pulls them even further. If you go down, gravity picks them up because of the owlets. So we have movement in both horizontal and vertical planes that our inner ear can receive and interpret based on gravity. Which means, would this all work if there was no gravity? Let's say you're in space. The system would be wholly different. That's why if you're in a weightless environment like in space, there is no set feeling of up or down because there's no gravity to impact these receptors. They're all based on the gravity we have here with our feet on the ground. So a little bit about the equilibrium of the ear. So now I've gone through the equilibrium as well as hearing of the ear at this point.